officially welcome to today's Women Energize Women event. My name is Geraldine Bastion, and I'm very much looking forward to moderating this panel session for you. And we'll begin by introducing the topic and then our speakers to you. So, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, in order to achieve this 1.5-degree goal, we really need to step up our game. We need a threefold increase in annual renewable energy capacity, and this requires really a whole different level of global ambition regarding renewables, improved infrastructure, regarding the policies that we have, the regulations, and of course, also workforce capacities, but also institutional capacities that we need to see this through. We also need to intensify our international cooperation, the funding we have available for this, and really see how we can align our efforts in order to provide affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy for all. So with the COP28 approaching, this Women Energize Women event aims to explore how we're going to do that, how we're going to triple renewables, and what kind of actions are needed, what kind of infrastructures are needed, what kind of policies are needed, and also listen to our speakers who are already working exactly on these aims of stepping up this game, as I said. So I'm very excited to introduce the three speakers that we'll have here for you in total. I'm joined by two now, and one will hopefully pop in a few minutes, but I'd like to introduce all three of them to you to begin with now. So first of all, a very warm welcome to Dr. Rethabile Melamu. She is a sustainability professional who's trained in chemical and environmental engineering. She has over 15 years of experience in the area of clean energy, green economy, environmental sustainability, enterprise development, life cycle assessment, and climate change. Her experience and work spans several sectors: renewable energy, waste management, water and sanitation also. And with her wealth of experience, both in the breadth of the sectors covered and the years spent, she's really a thought leader in the area of green economy and the energy sector. She develops policies, forward-looking policies, advises on this, on different national energy and green economy strategies that have been designed by her, and follows the implementation. She publishes on this topic matter. So like I said, really a thought leader, and it's fantastic to have her with us today. Welcome to the conversation. I'm
Thank
also
you very much.
Lovely to have you. Thank you. Now all three are here, so it's very lovely also to see you again and welcome you to this conversation, Dr. Rashi Gupta. Rashi is also fondly known as the Bilateral of India. She is a pioneer of manufacturing advanced lithium batteries in India, along with the world's smartest lithium battery. So she's the founder and managing director of Vision Mechatronics Private Limited, which is leading towards in the field of robotics, renewable energy, and energy storage. And she also recently joined the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, an independent advisory council in the United Nations Secretary General's realm. So really also an international leading figure on these topics, and fantastic to have you with us today, Rashi.
Thank you so much for having me here. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. And last but not least, I'm giving a very warm welcome to Eduarda Oliveira Zoghbi. And she's a development officer at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Originally, she's from Brazil, but now based in New York, and is focusing on bilateral and multilateral cooperation, partnerships, broadening the Rocky Mountain Institute's scope to work more strongly with players and actors in the Global South as well. Eduarda has over 8 years of experience managing climate and energy projects at different international organizations, including the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, United Nations, and a regional focus on Latin America and Africa, and is also an expert, has a background in working in the fulfillment of the SDGs, sustainable energy for all, and gender mainstreaming. So also a perfect speaker for our panel today, and fantastic to have you here, Eduarda.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited. This is a very impressive panel. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. It's my honor to be amidst the three of you, and also you, dear participants of this session. Just one more note of housekeeping before we kick off the discussion. Like I said, we'd love to hear from you as well. Please use the chat throughout the discussion to make your comments and remarks and ask questions. And toward the later part of the discussion, we'll also be opening it up in case you wish to interact directly with our speakers, also by coming in with your voice and picture. But now I'd like to address the first couple of questions to our distinguished panelists, and I'd like to start with you, Tabby. Thank you for allowing me to call you by your short name. So, as the CEO of SAPVIA and one of the women who are, and I'm quoting now, changing South Africa in the public sector, as I said, you have deep insights into both the industrial side of things, but also the political landscape regarding energy transition in South Africa. So I was hoping to begin with, we'll start with a bit of global mapping, since we have so many different global perspectives also represented here. Can you tell me a bit more about the state of the energy sector currently in South Africa, what the share of renewables is, specifically perhaps solar, and how would you map the field currently in South Africa?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Geraldine, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. And it's great to be sharing this panel with some fantastic and prolific ladies. You are indeed correct. I've had the privilege of working in the public sector for close to 10 years before I joined the private sector. So I do have insights both from the public sector and increasingly in the private sector. So let me start with your first question. And the question was, what is the state of the South African energy sector? In general, the energy sector in South Africa is in dire distress, whether it's in the liquid fuel space or electricity. But I think for the purpose of our conversation today, my focus will be to share insights of the electricity landscape in South Africa. So the distress that we are in is characterized by frequent and severe episodes of power cuts. And in South Africa, we have colloquially called these load shedding. It's characterized into stages. So the stages that we have experienced in 2023 alone range from stage 1 to stage 8. And just to describe what those mean is that at the higher the stage, the higher the numbers of load shedding hours. So on a typical day, if you happen to be load shed at stage 6, you are likely to be load shed for 12 hours. So there are many reasons for why we are in the trouble that we find ourselves in. The one is the fact that our coal fleet, power stations are aging. Maintenance wasn't done properly in the past. And so with age, these coal power stations break frequently, and if you don't maintain them that frequently, it leads to an endemic that we find ourselves in. Be that as it may, South Africans are coping, and things have improved a little bit in the past couple of months. In fact, in the past 5 days, when the Springboks were in France, we actually didn't have load shedding. So we had power consistently for 170 days. This was the first time this year that everyone across South Africa had 170 hours of interrupted electricity supply. So just to give you a sense of the challenge that we've experienced in terms of hours, we have experienced about 1,400 hours. That equates to over 60 days of full load shedding, right? So I'm mapping this to indicate the extent to which we need to fix our electricity system in South Africa. And the actual installed capacity of the fleet across the different technologies is about 58 gigawatts. And this 58 gigawatts is more than enough to supply all our needs. In fact, the demand at the highest peak demand for this year was 33 gigawatts. Yet our country couldn't generate 33 gigawatts, even in the middle of June, which is our winter. So really, that's the problem that we find ourselves. we have seen a very rapid growth of the renewable energy sector. And this is really propelled by the crisis that we find ourselves in, where households have adopted residential solar PV systems. We have seen the private sector also adopting renewable energy. So of that 58 gigawatts of installed capacity, about 15% of it is from renewable energy sources, in particular solar PV and wind. There is about 500 megawatts of concentrated solar power, but by and large, installed solar PV is the prominent solar technology in South Africa. And of that, about 4 gigawatts is installed at residential as well as commercial and industry. I know these are small numbers for India and maybe even Europe. I know Dr. Rashi will probably give us very staggering numbers. But yeah, that's where we are. Maybe just to end my input by indicating that the majority of this installed solar PV capacity has come online in the past 2 years, and that is due to some regulatory reforms. Besides the crisis that we find ourselves in, and I know we'll have an opportunity later to talk about some of the interventions that have really catalyzed the growth of the renewable energy sector in South Africa. But it's really positive. We've seen the growth in the region, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Southern Africa region. And I think we are well poised for a rapid growth of the renewable energy sector across the market segments. So let me stop here, Geraldine, and give others an opportunity to also share what's happening in their countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insights, Rethabile. I think it paints a very clear picture for our participants also coming from other world regions and the effects that has with these regular power cuts that you're experiencing and the load shedding system that you have. So thanks for making that very tangible. And there's a lot of points that you raised that I hope we'll be able to get back to. But as you said, we do want to map and travel around the world a little bit. So let's zoom over to India next. Rashi, as I said in the introduction, you were really one of the leading figures. You were featured as Asia's most influential women in renewable energy 2020 and have really also done so much to revolutionize the Indian renewable energy scene. So as we know, being most populous country, one of the most populous countries, and so much also increasing perhaps, let's say, role model figure situation that India has also with other countries paying more attention. How would you describe the current renewable energy development in India and a little outlook perhaps as well?
Yes. Thank you so much for giving me this question about country India. See, India has already done a lot of work on renewable energies, and today what we're doing is accelerating our renewable energies deployment. We are already putting up new manufacturing lines, right from the solar cell to module manufacturing. Module manufacturing, we are already at a gigawatt scale in India. But now we are seeing the cell manufacturing at a gigawatt scale coming up. Already 2 new factories have been put up by the top-notch solar manufacturers. Same thing we're doing with energy storage as well, because energy storage is also very crucial for us to put in, because otherwise renewable energies would not make sense without storing them in time. To use the actual value of the storage when you need it. So that is one thing that India is doing. Second thing, India has put up 2 new PLI schemes. That is a product linked incentive from the government to promote made in India, to promote manufacturing in India. Now, these 2 schemes are specifically for advanced cell chemistries in battery energy storage and into solar manufacturing. And the third PLI that has come is specifically for electronics manufacturing. So with these 3 PLIs, what we really know is that India is focusing on decarbonization, clean energy transformation. I will still not call it transition because it's complete transformation of what we have been traditionally using to what we are going to use in the next generations. So it's a complete transformation. What is true today for our generations will not be true for our children. It's going to be a different landscape of energy altogether. So we are actually working on a lot on decarbonization. We are hosting a lot of countries to come to India and learn what we have been doing. We are also very, very far ahead in the terms of electric vehicle space. Because and India is not a four-wheeler country, mind you, again, because our country has a different landscape, different geographical needs, different cultural needs, different human needs. Okay, so we are a little different from the way the world works. I mean, if I look at Europe, I'll be looking at more four-wheelers. If I look at US, I'll be looking at more four-wheeler segment. But India, we look at a two-wheeler segment. We're already the leader in two and three-wheelers in the EV domain. So that is how we are transforming the clean energies. Another thing is the government has also announced a viability gap funding for energy storage projects to have round-the-clock renewable energy power. RTC is what we call round-the-clock renewable energy power, and it is like in Indian rupees, I can tell you, 3,000 crores of viability gap funding exclusively for energy storage projects. There are many places in India where we have banned the use of diesel generators because we are very, very focused on the clean energy mission that we have. So, and what we are doing is we are doing a lot of pilot projects. We are trying to decarbonize transport. We are trying to decarbonize electrical grids. We are forming microgrids at multiple locations to actually bring in a lot of clean energy into the system. So, but one thing that we still need to do more is a decentralized approach to energy storage and solar projects. Or rather renewable energy projects for that matter. I would not classify it only as solar. You can have wind, you can have biogas, you can have many renewable energies coming into picture. So what we're now looking at is having a decentralized mode. We are very good at centralized large-scale projects. We have done immense. We've already crossed something, I think like 12 gigawatts we've already crossed. If I'm not mistaken, the correct figure should be around 12. We've already crossed that. And we have already crossed our Paris climate agreements. We have achieved that already. We're ahead of that. But we are still to achieve our decarbonization goals that we have set for 2030. So we still have a long race to go, and not just India. I'm seeing everybody across the globe has to run the race to save the mankind. So that's from me from India for now.
Thank you very much. I mean, like, it's not always that a very positive picture is painted, but so far there's a very, we're going to get this done and we're doing it vibe. So it's very uplifting to hear. I'd like to zoom in onto the Americas next and go over to Eduarda. So I mentioned you've worked in Brazil, but also in different international contexts. Of course, we're going to get in a minute also to the policy side of things and to talk a little bit how political frameworks matter. Maybe you can already kind of segue us into that, because we've seen, of course, a lot of also changes in leadership in a number of South American countries. And I'd love to hear your general take on the efforts and commitment to SDG 7 in the Americas, where you see the current developments.
Those are really good questions. A lot to unpack in this discussion, but thank you again for the invitation. And I think that as the representative of Latin America here in the panel, I can start by saying that, Latin America has the cleanest energy matrix in the world as a region, and 60% of our electricity coming from renewable energy resources, which Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Chile and Venezuela account for about 82% of the installed renewable energy capacity in the region. But that also means that we're heavily reliant on hydropower for electricity, which for many decades has served us very well. But with climate change, it has become more and more of a struggle to have our reservoirs at the levels that we needed, and our grids heavily reliant on hydropower electricity. And in recent years, this has been, the droughts and the change in rain patterns have really made us rely more and more in thermal generation, which is costly, which impacts people, which makes, when it comes to SDG 7, we make electricity less affordable to citizens and impacts especially the poorest ones. But I will say that when it comes to political constraints, I don't see renewable energy as being something as controversial as one may think. And I say this because, in the Brazilian experience, when we had the Bolsonaro administration until recently, he was known for being a climate denier. He was also known for a lot of political setbacks in the environmental agenda. But renewable energy was the one thing that he was supportive of. And, one of the reasons why is, and I think this is not just in Latin America, but in many regions, is that we see that the importance of markets and the importance of investors going to our regions and really moving the needle that sometimes the government doesn't. So now we're having a few of our countries, I think Bolivia and Argentina have upcoming elections. And I think that, the issues that we see are not necessarily linked to making the energy transition happen in our region, because we already reached a very, high level of renewable energy penetration in our systems. I think that the biggest constraint and the biggest challenge for us now is not moving backwards. And I think that, the International Energy Agency's recent World Energy Outlook talked about, the possibility of natural gas becoming more and more important in Latin America, which is what we're trying to transition from, right? All over the world, trying to make fossil fuels represent less of our total energy matrix. And we're seeing that, and for example, something that scares me, there was a report from the New York Times this year saying that Brazil is the third country in the world that has committed to exploring oil and gas, I think by 2030 or by 2050. But just to say that we were one of the countries that was looking forward to the most in exploring oil resources. And we have to remember that a lot of the countries in the world that have oil and gas have also made their revenues, the revenues from oil and gas dependent on the growth of the state, and that has trapped some of some countries in the world, including Venezuela, which is a massive oil, producer, and was trapped in this whole dynamic of, before being an agricultural country and having a diversified economy, and being trapped in an oil, situation in an economy that is very volatile to international markets. So we really want to be aware of expanding our non-hydro resources, but also keeping in mind that we have to be aware of this balance between fossil fuels and their expansions in the region. But then to answer, I think the one of the questions in this larger set of questions about SDG 7, I think that when we talk about SDG 7, what comes to my mind is always the energy access gap, which we know that 2/3 of it are in sub-Saharan Africa. But I think that this 1/3 in Southeast Asia and this part in Latin America, especially in my region, has been very overlooked, because we have reached almost 100% electricity access in many Latin American countries, not all. And the biggest issue is that SDG 7 talks about not leaving anyone behind. And our challenge is reaching that last mile of electrification in Latin American countries, because not leaving anyone behind means that the 100,000 people in Brazil, in the Amazon, have to also be included in the energy access policy. And for many, many years, because we have full-on electrification, we also forget that it's not reliable or it's not affordable. And because of the pandemic and the war on Ukraine and how it has affected global energy markets, energy has become more expensive, making people that already had access, and this not just in Latin America, lose access to energy because they could no longer afford it. And it was a trade-off between other health costs or food costs and other services that people need. So what I see for the development of Latin America in the upcoming years is a larger focus on the Amazon. And with that said, Brazil's very likely going to host COP30 in the Amazon, which is, I think, a first when it comes to taking 50,000 people to an area where we talk so much about. We talk about the development, but we forget that the Amazon is not just a rainforest. It's not just like the world's lungs, as we like to call it, but it's also a place of people. And it's a place where we have the most impoverished people in Latin America. So I think that when we think about SDG 7 is how do we bring electricity to these areas, which are remote locations, which are extremely hard to get. So some of them you will be in boats for 3 days to get to these people. They currently rely on diesel generators, which I think is a reality for most, of our countries represented here in this panel. So how can we make this affordable and make this energy clean and reliable? I think is the next challenge that we're looking in Latin America, and trying not to leave anyone behind despite the small numbers for that last mile of electrification.
Thank you. I think that was also really tangible, and it paints a very diverse picture of the different realities that we are currently experiencing when it comes to renewable energy access. I'll go back around the other way now. So I'll stay with you for a minute, Eduarda. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit, especially given the fact that some governments have been more on the supportive side than perhaps other governments around the world waking up to this in South America. What role do you think other actors in civil society, activism, NGOs, etc., are playing to keep this forward movement and to make sure that there's no backward movement, as you described, but also really to raise attention to those whose voices maybe are not currently being heard?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, I think, because at the end of the day, I do believe that civil society is what is moving the needle in a lot of our countries. And we sometimes forget that a lot of climate action started by, activism and movements in our countries that created change. And, I'm a person that spent, about 10 years, nearly a decade, working in youth-led movements. So I can speak a lot about that experience, and I'm curious about what my panelists here will also contribute. But what I would like to highlight in this panel is that there's a growing interest of young people to be part of the energy sector, and there's a big lack of skills, of access to education, access to opportunities, access to seed funding for youth-led entrepreneurial ideas that are arising in the energy sector. And a lot of these solutions are very locally based and sometimes overlooked by the international community. And just a reminder that today, and I was looking at these numbers before the session, there are over 1.8 billion young people in the world, and 90% of this number are in developing countries. And the youngest population in the world, if these numbers are correct, will be in sub-Saharan Africa, with 70% of the population being under 30. And I think this is very powerful, and it shows how much we have to invest in the skills of this next generation to be more and more active in the discussions, not only about SDG 7, but also international negotiations. And there are also more than 235 million youth in India and 225 million in China. So I think, coming to the realm of the BRICS, I think that we have a massive potential that is untapped, which is young people. And to give a very clear example of how young people throughout the last decade have organized themselves, I like giving the example of Yango, which is the youth constituency to the UNFCCC. And in the Paris Agreement, the section about education, which is very small, but it's there, was a big advocacy result from Yango at COP21, talking with policymakers. And at that time, it was extremely hard. My organization that was Brazilian and youth-led was also involved in this process. And it was really hard because young people are very often underestimated, and they want to be part of the process. They have a different experience on the ground. Most of them are educators. I used to go to schools to talk about climate change in areas where people have never heard of climate change. So I think that these types of knowledge and experiences have to be more valued if we're talking about tripling renewables, if we're talking about achieving SDG 7. And it just shows the power of articulation of young people to be able to influence in a process like the Paris Agreement. And this continues. This is something that I'm still seeing in the discussions around the SDG 7. Now, now the UN is discussing the midpoint to the 2030 SDGs. And I'm also seeing a lot of young people present, which is something very new. And what they bring to the table is quite unique, and it's a perspective that is very needed when we talk about civil society and the role that they play. And just to wrap it up, to open to the other panelists, I also think that we have to remember the importance of traditional knowledge. And I say this because all of our countries here represented, and I'm sure also the participants of today, have indigenous people in their territories. And I think that this is something that we tend to forget. These are groups that have been marginalized, that have been excluded from the process. We're talking later about the just energy transition, but I think that when we're talking about inclusion of civil society, it's not just the think tanks, the nonprofits that already have a name, but it's also finding new ways of integrating these movements, these alliances that are arising and that are very powerful and have a great potential to contribute to these discussions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pass this back around the circle. And Rashi, you were nodding along to a lot of what Eduarda was saying. So I would love to hear how this relates also to the Indian context to your work. And maybe you can also share your thoughts on the one point Eduarda was talking about. How do we create better connections between these local efforts, local activism, local knowledge, and the global levels, or at least the international policy fora that you are also involved in, please?
Well, I would agree a lot with what Eduarda said. And see, what happens is, like, there's a pyramid. And 90% of the people are at the bottom of the pyramid. And the same is the problem with energy. The maximum use of energy is, when you consider the quantum of people that are affected with this are at the bottom of the pyramid. And the policies that are there are at the top of the pyramid, which do not percolate to the bottom of the pyramid. And with the climate emergency, I will still say not the climate change, with the climate emergency. And I'm referring this because I can see a lot of changes from what I have seen in my childhood to what I'm experiencing now in my mid-adulthood. And I'm realizing that if this continues, I would not see the human race after this at the pace it is continuing. I mean, leave aside what we are going to have for our generations of the next, we will be extinct. So what I would say is here is that, for the pyramid, please everyone look at the pyramid, look at how the policies, the benefits, the financial incentives have to percolate to the bottom. And that's one way of, one thing that I would say is put in decentralized efforts for energy. What every country today needs is a mix of the right energy mix for them. Okay, each country is different, each country is very unique, each country has its own cultural patterns, energy patterns, usage and consumption patterns, generation patterns. Like if we have a 300-day sunshine, Europe does not have. America may have, may not have. I mean, so, it's a different pattern everywhere. What we need to realize is that we have to harness the maximum out of these patterns. Look at how we can have these policies percolate right to the ground level. Because if that is not happening, we are missing out on the maximum number of people, maximum number of beneficiaries. We need to get to that. And if we really need SDG 7, We have to work in a public-private partnership. Today, it's only the government and industry is working. We are trying to do a bit. We are trying to innovate on the products. We are trying to bring a new policy. But today, what we really need is support from the people, because they are the final beneficiaries of whatever policy or industry or any not-for-profit or for-profit is doing. For whom are we doing all of this? For the masses, right? For the people, for the countrymen. And if they have to be educated, made aware, they have to be participating actively in this. Each one of us has to participate. We cannot say it is the government's problem. It is industry's problem. It is my problem. I am the creator of this problem and I have to solve this problem. And there is a very big disconnect. Even in India, there's a very big disconnect, you know. The young, very young children are realizing the needs of this because they have not seen what a cool breeze is sitting below a tree. They have not felt that. We were still privileged to have that. You know, they are still underprivileged. So we have to make a very, very, very big effort to educate, to make people realize what are they going to miss out on if they do not act now. We're talking of tripling by 2030. We have to do it now. There will not be another 2030 for all of us if we don't do it now. And that I say this for India, I say this for all the countries, and my heart goes out to Africa because they are the most underprivileged continent today on the planet, and they need a lot of support from all of us who are developed, who are developing, to actually bring about. And you know, we have to all go in this together. We cannot leave one continent, we cannot leave one country on the planet and say that it's okay. I mean, they will come up, they will catch up. No, we all have to hold hands in this and work and walk together. That is when we all will achieve our climate goals. That is when we all will achieve the true meaning of diversity and inclusion. If we can achieve SDG 7, if we can have power access for all, energy access to all, this is when we achieve diversity and inclusion. Not just by talking, not just by writing articles, not just by speaking on conferences. Each one of us has to take an effort to actually do this. What I have done now is very simple. Just 1 second, I will take 1 more second. I have done a very simple thing. I just ask 5 people to pass it on. Simple steps, small baby steps. I make sure that I give it to 5 and then I request those 5 people to pass it on to 5. Simple. If we try in this model, each one of us are going to be very successful.
Thank you. And let's perhaps we can get back into the discussion also to see what does that mean in practice? Because I think, again, we map really well that there's a lot of different realities out there. So passing on the knowledge how you can become politically active and vote for the right parties that we're going to put the right policies in place. I think there's a few things that we can all totally sign up for and agree with. And we've had so many great also initiatives as part of our Women Energize Women series, like Solar Sisters, who are really busy making sure everybody has access from the most sort of underprivileged communities, but the ones really who would benefit also incredibly from access to clean energy. So I think total alignment there. At the same time, coming from a country like Germany, I feel there's a lot of pressure on the individual to fix the world, whereas many industries and other entities perhaps this is the general sentiment, have been given a little bit more of a free ride. So perhaps we can also talk a little bit about specific steps and policies that we need. Tabby, I would love to bring you back in on this as well to see, as I mentioned earlier, you're also invested in creating these policies that we needed or advising on these. So perhaps you can share a little bit more circling back to the topics that we had on the panel, Eduarda talked a lot about the political support she's seeing and experiencing on national levels. So it'd be great if you could come in and share what the situation in South Africa, also sub-Saharan region, perhaps neighboring countries is on that, if you know. And otherwise, also, where would you see these specific policy levers that we need in order to make sure that perhaps, you know, the individuals are engaged, but not all the responsibility on fixing things lies on them?
Yo, thank you. And really a great inputs from the other panelists. I particularly like this notion of a transformation that Dr. Rashi referred to, because we so bogged down by this transition, a movement to somewhere, that sometimes forget that you need to fundamentally transform communities. And this is particularly important in a continent, especially sub-Saharan Africa, where I think it's Eduarda who alluded to the fact that 2/3 of the global population without access to clean and affordable electricity are based on. I think just to put that into context, we're looking at 600 million people. And that is half of the population of sub-Saharan Africa, or close to half. So we're dealing in our context with a mammoth task of energy access, energy security, right? So to answer the question on political support for a scale up of renewable energy, I think South Africa has done a lot, and I can give examples of some of the initiatives that they have pursued. But I am beginning to see our African leaders being very vocal on global platforms about our contribution to climate change or climate emergency, as Dr. Rashi has alluded to or refers to it, is that we still contribute about 3% of global emissions as an entire continent. 2% of that is probably from my country, South Africa, my adopted country, South Africa. But yet we have and are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. So I am seeing the political rhetoric going towards how do we get the continent to be more resilient? Yes, part of transitioning towards tripling the renewable energy contribution, it's a great one because it fundamentally deals with the challenges that we face as a continent. But I'm beginning to hear African leaders saying, one, finance this transformation or transition. And secondly, make sure that as we transition, as we get to that 2030 target and SDG 7 goal or SDG 5, which is important for the crowd here, we remain resilient. If anything, I'm not sure how familiar, or maybe some of the news don't make it to mainstream European media. The floods, the frequent of floods in the continent have displaced a lot of people. These are stories that people do not want. So whilst there is increasing support to increase the uptake of renewable energies on the one hand, there is a political push for the global and multilateral organization to support a resilience agenda for the continent, so that as we are transitioning, as we are pursuing energy access goals, we still remain resilient. We still remain in the communities within which we are located. Be that as it may, from a South African context, I think it has demonstrated fantastic leadership. The South African government, it has introduced a public procurement of renewable energy technologies. This program is over 10 years. It is touted as one of the best public-led procurement program in the world. It has led to about 6 gigawatts of renewables on the grid. Those are connected with about 4 gigawatts that are going to come online in the next year or two, but with a huge pipeline of projects that are being developed. Another milestone or major regulatory intervention has been to open up the private sector market, in that before, just 2 years ago, it would be impossible for a private developer to generate power and sell it on to another private player. So what South African has done is to remove a need for a license for private generators that are selling on to private producers. What that has done is increase the appetite. I think that is also coupled with the energy crisis challenge that I alluded to in the beginning. And what private generators, however, ought to do is to ensure that all the projects that they're developing are registered with our national regulator. So as an entity, a solar association, we are tracking these projects very closely. And we've seen that we have registered about 3 gigawatts of private projects. So we're seeing that the private sector project or led projects are outpacing the public procurement. So that is one of the interventions that government has put in place. And of course, they are working on liberalizing the market. Most of the utilities, not just in South Africa, vertically integrated, where you have one company responsible for generation, transmission, and distribution. What government is beginning to do is to review and revise the electricity regulation bill, which will have 3 distinct companies responsible for different parts of the value chain and open up the participation of the private sector. And yeah, I think various other regulation at local government where residential systems are now incentivized. So there are lots of instruments that are encouraging the uptake of renewable energy. But from a financing point of view, as a continent, we find ourselves in a very, very tight corner where we have all these developmental needs, not just provision of electricity. We have a burden of providing a world-class healthcare to our population. We have a burden of educating. And with that, we still feel that a burden to transition, or sometimes that's how it's looked at, given the amount of emission that we contribute to the global. It's just too much. And that the commitments that the Western countries made in Paris are not being lived up to. And instead, what is beginning to happen is that for just transition imperatives, we are, as a continent, are beginning to get loans instead of grants to increase the uptake. So from a financial point of view of financing of this project, I think we're finding ourselves between a rock and a hard place in that we want to transition. It's important. It's important because there are 600 million that need to get access to electricity, clean forms of electricity. And I think politically, there is increasing belief that if we are to do that, we need to exploit, one, some of the best resources that we have in the world. The entire continent, sub-Saharan Africa, has the best solar resources, has the best wind resources. And we do feel that that is a lever for us to achieve SDG 7, but those need to be financed. And those that have promised to finance, yes, we have a part to play as African governments. We are not exonerating our responsibilities elsewhere. But those that disproportionately benefited from fossil fuels for their development need to support. I think Dr. Rashi and Eduarda says, if we are not to leave anyone else behind, we need to show commitment by our actions. I think there is a popular saying that says, talk is cheap. And I think if you haven't been to the rural parts of the continent, haven't had to live with people that have to walk kilometers to charge their mobile phones. I'm not talking about having light in their home. I'm talking about just charging a mobile phone so that you can communicate. You can't quite relate with the tripling. So from a political point of view, I think what will drive and push a tripling of renewable energy is really a need to meet our energy access, energy security imperative. And we see renewable energy, at least the politicians see renewable energy as one of the key solutions. The prices have gone down. It's modular. You know, you don't have to develop robust infrastructure, transmission networks, distribution networks. There are options around mini grids. So from a political will, there's a political will, but it's prioritizing energy access, energy security, or secondly, or maybe the last point, what I'm beginning to see in some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'll use our neighbor Namibia as an example, is looking to renewable energy as a catalyst for emergent industries, green hydrogen as an example. So if you were asked to ask anybody in Namibia what the government strategy is, they will say green, what the 4 priorities of government are in the next 5 years. They will say the first one is green hydrogen, second one green hydrogen, third one green hydrogen, and so on and so forth. So I think from some of the countries in the region, we're beginning to see that as a driver for advancing renewable energy. In countries like Kenya, for instance, where the electricity mix is 80% renewable, and I think largely from hydropower as well. What we are beginning to see is the deployment of renewable energy for productive use. How do we make sure that we use renewable energy to advance our agricultural produce? So we're beginning to see all those creative uses of electricity, but really from energy security point of view. Yeah.
Okay, so many great points to tap into. The last point that you mentioned was actually a question I was going to ask Eduarda earlier, because as you alluded to the, advancement of some countries, that exactly that sort of sectoral use and where you're seeing innovative use cases coming forth. Maybe that's something we can pick up later, because I think that's a very interesting point you made at the end. I do want to talk a little bit about cooperation and still stay on the policy side. I'm also viewing the chat. So there's a lot of going on. We started receiving some questions in the chat that I'm going to try to weave into the conversation, and we will open up for your direct interventions. But it's also great to hear what you're discussing there. So please keep those comments coming. And it's also really great to see how global the participation is in the chat. We had one of the questions come up earlier, like, how do you convince political leadership that is not on board yet with promoting and financially investing in renewable energies? So I'm trying to weave what you said just now, Tabby, into a question here, because I'm wondering if this, this view onto the future, also where will there be large investments coming in from Western countries or development cooperation investments coming in? Is that also a lever to get countries and governments that have not yet been interested in joining the conversation talking, as in the run for renewable energy, for green hydrogen, that's definitely going to come from Europe and is just starting to happen now? Is that a good sales factor and pitch for governments who have not yet bought onto the renewable energies discussion? Open to whoever wants to take that.
Maybe I can start, Geraldine. I was asked a similar question a couple of months. I think it was another German podcast, and I did indicate that Africans are becoming very, I think, pragmatic and wise. They are realizing that in the past they have been exploited, and that if there is an emerging industry, they need to capitalize on it. And the very simple answer to your question is yes. People are beginning to open up because there are tangible, at least perceived tangible outcomes and economic benefits, local economic and socio-economic benefits that come from the emergent or development of a new industry. So whilst Europe will benefit from their decarbonization agenda, there is a perception and an understanding that they will not develop, that development will lead to local development. And in a country, I think we talked about the fact that about 600 million people, really close to my heart, because I feel that if this generation doesn't do something about it, our future generation will suffer. And I think it will be a missed opportunity for this generation not to exploit opportunities that are available to us. But in the case of some of the African countries, even South Africa, those of you who followed the JET IP funding would know that there is a bit of a stalemate with its disbursement, because there are internal conversations on what really is important for us. Does it make sense to indebt our country again and take on new loans just to advance an industry? But overall, I think the industry development will proceed, because we see value, not just from export value, if some of these green hydrogen developments will lead to exports, but also on the decarbonization of our local industries. I think in the context of South Africa, this is particularly important for steel manufacturing, for companies like Sasol, which is one of the big oil beneficiation or fossil to chemical company in the world. So yeah, I think there's openness, but the openness is underpinned by, we need to drive a socio-economic agenda, and we need to get half of these young people. And I think it's Eduarda who alluded to the fact that 70% of the youngest people in the world are in the continent. I think I would add that to say, actually, most of them under the age of 25 are not employed. So not only are we facing, the problem of energy security, but it's a serious unemployment challenge in the continent. And if the renewable energy, if investment in green hydrogen will enable us to unlock socio-economic opportunities, by all means, leaders right on getting people into jobs. That's their selling point. That's the politician's selling point. Yeah.
Yes, and of course, in any democracy, that would also align with votes.
Yeah, absolutely, votes.
So a lot of convincing arguments there. Hopefully, also some that would work in less democratic countries, especially the economic ones that you outlined. Rashi, Eduarda, is there anything you want to add to that from your sides? Otherwise, I'd move on to the next questions around COP and cooperation, but you can add if you like. Well, then we've already, this is, I think, a really interesting point of the conversation that we're on. And I'd like to segue a little bit into some of the cooperation questions, also, of course, in the forerun of COP28 and your perspectives on what you hope is going to happen there. Maybe just, maybe we'll do that. And then I'll circle back, perhaps, if we have some time, to the green hydrogen topic in that context as well. So, perhaps starting with you, Eduarda, where would you see the key things that going into the next round of conversations there you are hoping for, and where do you see some key levers in international cooperation specifically for this next next level of stepping up in terms of tripling the renewable energies?
Yes. Well, I think that to answer this question, I'm going to remove all my hats and answer from a very personal perspective. Like you mentioned when you were making the introduction, I've worked a lot. I worked within the multilateral system, and I worked in a country office in Brazil, which is very different than working in a headquarter. Decisions are made differently. Decisions are sometimes made by the headquarters, but then the implementation is something that the country offices do at the multilateral organizations. And I think that one thing that, we've been discussing a lot at COPs is the MDB reform. So we know that thanks to Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, we're discussing the fact that more and more developing countries are getting debts in order to adapt to climate change, in order to mitigate greenhouse gases in their countries. And this has, constrained a lot the economies. And what for me is needed right now is a real reform of the MDBs, because from my experience, and this is something a lot of people don't come across in their sectors, is that when I was in Brazil, sometimes we would see a huge opportunity for a project in a part of the country that, you had people that were extremely poor, that were really suffering the effects of climate change. But these projects would not be approved because the bank establishes which states in a country have the capacity to have a debt, right? So the decisions are not made based on need. The decisions are made based on, debt capacity. And I think that this is the type of mindset that has operated since the MDBs existed, post-World Wars. And it's the mentality that needs to change urgently. We cannot afford having, the multilateral banks, which are, very important for offering guarantees, for reducing risks, for thinking about innovative financial instruments to deploy renewable energy all around the world. If they're only doing this based on thinking first about the loans, and obviously they are banks. They're first and foremost banks. Development comes second. So I think that, there's this very important need to change. And I think Dr. Rashi said something for me that stood out that I was thinking about, which was the pyramid. And for me, the image of the pyramid is the top of the pyramid. The decision makers from multilateral banks are the same decision makers geopolitically that have existed for decades. The world system still operates in a very colonial way. And I think that the way that I see, for example, African governments talking about them representing only 3% of global emissions is, for me, something that is hardly understood by development players, by donors, by the international community, which have already committed to not funding fossil fuels anymore in Africa, for example. And when I talk to my African friends, the response is, Africa needs to industrialize. If we want to alleviate poverty, we need to have the chance to industrialize. And I think we still have this Kyoto Protocol differentiation of Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries, where you have these countries that have the responsibility to provide finance, their common but differentiated responsibilities. But at the same time, I think they haven't been to a lot of these places. I think Rethabile was saying that they have not experienced what it is to not have electricity for 24 hours. As women, they have often not experienced what it is to walk on an empty street with no lights and having no idea what's going to happen to you. And I think that what we're missing in the international community is many times empathy. It's thinking that these are people that are struggling, and even though not just for MDBs, but also for private sector companies investing in our countries, it's also about serving the population. It's not just about the profits. And I don't want to diverge too much of the topic, but I think that everything has to change. The whole way we approach the financial systems, but the way we also approach development has to change immediately. And I think that here, and I brought again a number, I pulled it because the World Bank and the IEA, IRENA, I think a lot of these very renowned energy organizations, they publish every year the SDG 7 tracking report. And they always compare the number of people from 2010 to 2020 or 2021, 22 that have received electricity, or the number of people that no longer need access to clean cooking because they already gained access. And they have a metric for SDG 7, which is the international capital flows in support of clean energy in developing countries. And what they have acknowledged in their latest report is that these numbers have gone down since the pandemic and have continued to fall down in 2021. So in 2021, this number amounted to $10.8 billion, which was already an 11% drop from 2020 and 35% less than the range of 2010 to 2019. And only about 40% of the 2017 peak of 26.4 billion. So we have less than half of the financial flows going to energy related investments in the developing world than we had in 2017. And they also acknowledge the fact that these commitments remain heavily concentrated in a handful of countries. So this to say that, if we go to Latin America, we know that countries like Brazil, Colombia receive a lot of attention, Peru as well. You go to Africa, you have Kenya, you have Nigeria. But what about the Sahel? What about the places where like all the investors are scared to put their money on because there are conflicts, or because, you know, there are higher risks, or because they might have an anticipated idea of returns? And the last point that I'm going to make when it comes to international finance and COPs is the perception of risk. I've had this wonderful class in grad school, which the professor was saying that all of the rating agencies, they're based in New York, they're based in London, and these are like top students from usually developed countries that are the ones doing the ratings of our countries. And it's very complicated to use the same methodology for one country, for all different countries in one region, and that ends up, you know, to having, you know, AAA ratings or, you know, B- ratings, and that defines how investors are going to put their money. And we've shown, and what this professor showed us, is that actually Africa has one of the lowest default rates in the international system, and yet it's still very hard to receive new loans. So I think that what we need, and just I'm going to end here, is to really diversify the way that we approach these problems. And for for multilateral development banks and international organizations as a whole, we need to bring people like us, like the panelists here, to decision-making positions, or even to be part of these dialogues, because the way the pyramid is structured is that this top here, in decision-making positions, we know how they look like, we know what they're doing, and it has not worked for decades. So I think it's time for a very radical change, because we're really close to the deadline of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we just have to think differently and have a systems thinking approach to these problems.
Rashi, yes, it calls for a round of applause. I know you have been working at breaking open the status quo, you know, like breaking open the glass ceiling, and and not just for yourself, but for others to like step in that path as well. Maybe you want to link onto what Eduarda just said in terms of also your hopes and expectations, of course, for COP, excuse me, but also, yeah, how can we perhaps support each other in these efforts? I know we're all doing that, and you're all doing that with the fantastic and important work we're doing. But yeah, how can we also make sure we step up that game?
I completely agree with what Eduarda just said, because she just actually read my mind, you know, when when she was talking about the radical change, when she was talking about, changing the decision makers, including more of us, more of women in that. Something that I really wish, it's something that it's perfect sight as of now, but I really want this to happen, is collaboration. Collaboration between people, collaboration between countries and continents. We have to come together. All of us are facing this emergency. It's not just India, or it's not just Brazil, it's not just Africa, it's not Europe, all of us. For COP, I really wish that we can actually collaborate and not just negotiate. We have to grow up from negotiation to collaboration. That is one wish list from COP. I really, really want to see that, at least if not in 28, 29, COP29 or COP30 at least. To have, it's a very high hope, you know, that I'm having. But someday I believe that it will be a reality. We all will be collaborating and not negotiating anymore. We have to learn to share. We have to learn to care for everyone on the planet, not just our families. The world is a family. We have to share with the underprivileged, with the underdeveloped, and we have to learn to care for all of us. So that is one wish list that I have from COP. And another thing that I want to really highlight is that we need to include more women, more young children. I am not going to classify young women and men there. I want young children to come on board. It's very important. It's very important for each one of us to work in our own countries, in our societies, in our localities, in our regions that we belong to collectively bring these women and children on board in the clean energy decade. Because see, what has happened is, traditionally the education system, the financial system, the policy making, the governments, everyone has been acting very traditionally till date, and they're controlled by men. Nothing bad about it. We need men. I'm not going to discard them out or just say no, only women. No. What I'm saying is that men, please give us some space. Do not be scared of us. We are not encroaching in your space or taking away your jobs. Please don't be scared of us. Give us some space so that we can reduce the burden that you are going through at this point of time. We can help in creating a more equitable, sustainable ecosystem, which is really needed for our planet, for all of us, all the human beings as well. And if we cannot do that today, there is no point of any collaboration or negotiation or even financial aids and incentives, or even for that matter, loans and debt. Not going to make sense. So that is my wish list from everyone. I mean, I'm really hoping too high. I know that, but somewhere in my heart, I have a belief that together we are stronger. Together we all can achieve it. And as Women Energize Women initiatives, we are taking a lot of effort to bring us all on one platform at least to push this initiative ahead. And I think that young girls and young women and mothers, professionals, all of us, if we come together, we can bring this change for sure.
Thank you, Rashi. I mean, those would already be beautiful closing words, but we're not over yet. So don't go away. But that's very much captures, of course, the whole sentiment of why we host these events and how beautiful it is to come together here and also encourage each other, because, of course, there's a lot of pioneering women out there trying to do work in their societies, their communities. So it's great to also hear your voices, your experience, and your support. So I want to open it up in a minute, but I want to ask one question a little bit selfishly, because this has kind of been lingering on my mind since another green hydrogen discussion of a few weeks ago. And green hydrogen seems to be a topic of interest because we're getting a lot of questions on this in the chat. Also, how could small-scale initiatives be supported? A question coming in from a colleague from Angola. So let's also hopefully answer that in a minute. Perhaps just on the sentiment of cooperation, and also circling back a little bit to what you were saying earlier, Tabby. Of course, it's important. We are completely, of course, I think we all agree with what you just said, Rashi. We need each other. This is a global affair. We're in it together. Yeah. And at the same time, it's so important to get also cooperation right, especially when it's Western countries wanting to cooperate with countries in the global South, and perhaps having a little bit of a new dynamic, let's say, with renewable energy rich countries in terms of resources being attractive in other ways now for partnerships around green hydrogen, then maybe also attractive for other resources in the past. But of course, the hope is to not get things as badly wrong as in the past, but a less exploitative, more actual partnership going in many ways. So as you were talking earlier, Tabby, it was just this kind of question that's been lingering on my mind got back to me a little bit, because I was in a discussion where a German leading politician on this topic of green hydrogen said that there's so much, these partnerships are so great because then, countries like South Africa can produce renewable energy, and countries like Germany can come and buy that up for green hydrogen products. And the sentence actually felt that there's no inherent value in electrification. There's more of an inherent value in the selling off of additional energy sources. So thinking back to what you were saying earlier in terms of the lack of energy stability in South Africa, this statement just popped back into my mind. And the question of how do we set the right frame and tone for partnerships in order to not repeat the same mistakes of the past, but to really make sure partnerships happen to the benefit of all members of society and people involved. Yeah, that's, I guess, a question I'd like to get back to you with.
Yeah, I think great question, Geraldine. I think for us to achieve that ideal that the two colleagues have alluded to, we need a paradigm shift, right? From the Europeans have to have their own paradigm shift. You cannot use the 1960s, 1970s mentality of I don't think in the minds it's exploitative. It's perhaps meant to assist Africa, but it's Eurocentric in its approach. We have a decarbonization agenda. Here is plenty of land that is inhabited in the middle of Africa. And if they can use it, and generate electricity, we will get that hydrogen and then decarbonize and advance our agenda. But if the mindset is such that we understand the needs of the people or our potential partner, and we want to have a mutually beneficial partnership where we are able to advance our cause of decarbonization and help advance the cause, I think, associated to socio-economic development agenda. The truth is that where the hydrogen economy or hydrogen generation is earmarked in the country, it's in the middle of nowhere. So it won't make sense anyway to generate electricity there and try to transmit and distribute it to marginalized communities. That requires a totally different solution where decentralized solar mini grids are established close to where the energy is needed. We still have that land. We can exploit it to our benefits, but we need to make sure that from those that want to benefit from the land, they have a win-win mindset towards it. The same goes to our leadership in the continent, where we don't have to beg as African continents, as other regions in the world. We have the resources. And in fact, whenever we talk about this electric mobility, most of the resources for electric mobility will come out of sub-Saharan Africa. Cell phones, they are already coming out of that region anyway. So we remain resource rich in all sorts of ways, but we have this poverty mentality. And this mentality that says anything that comes out of Africa is good, anything that is Western is good, and therein also requires a mind shift, a paradigm shift. So from both sides, from the European point of view, to ensure that it's a win-win situation, they get what they want without exploiting the community or the partner that they're collaborating with. And from our side, we shouldn't give away our resources cheaply because we're so desperate to get resources and then be undermined and underplayed and sell our resources for less than they are going for. So in a way, we need that collaboration that Dr. Rashi referred to, but it needs to be steeped in really intentional collaboration and partnership and a win-win type of mindset where we win as a continent because the resources belong to us, but we also benefit from those that want to sell our resources. So I see huge opportunities for green hydrogen. I think it's just personally not wearing a SAPVIA hat. I think it's more hype than it should be. I think it's a few years down the line, we 5-7 years away from serious commercialization, but we do need to invest now. But we need to understand how it's going to benefit the men on the street. I know there are questions on the chat board. How do SMMEs benefit? I've been asked, how do young people exploit opportunities? No, it's just hyped. Governments are investing a lot of resources. There's a webinar this, seminar this. There are lots of them in Africa, not just in South Africa. where we having this green hydrogen, and it's still very far removed. It's elitist. So if I don't have power to charge my phone, I'm thinking, why are you even telling me about green hydrogen? You know. Anyway, I'm not even sure I'm answering your question, Geraldine, but yeah, that's
No, Tabby, you
that's
did.
my
You did.
view. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And you touched on other topics that I was wondering about a little bit. So, also since I'm not an expert in all energy field areas, it's very helpful to learn from your perspectives here, and also the space that we have for different scale of projects, for different, how can the very decentral and the very local work alongside perhaps the large and the international. So it was interesting to hear you touch on that as well. I'm not sure if we fully addressed the question from the lady of Angola, which was, she has a green hydrogen project. So what steps can she take to start looking at this sector and support for her project in a country like Angola? In case anybody has any more tips for her, please feel free. And with that, I would please, Rashi. And then with that, I would really like to open up for your questions and interventions. If you want to switch on your camera and your microphone, you can do so, and we'll welcome you to the conversation. Rashi, please.
Yeah, so the girl or lady who is asking me this question, I would say first assess on what your project is, okay, and look at the cost and value, rather a price value analysis of what you're trying to create. In terms of in terms of what is your expenditure and what is your value that you will create in doing this entire project for your customer. And then try to find what are the resources that you have in your country around you. If not, what do you have to get from other countries or import? Once you have this short analysis, you can actually make a value out of your proposition, whether it makes sense. You can take a decision whether you want to go ahead with this project now or keep it for later. Simple, short, this is how you can go ahead.
I hope that somebody was taking notes there, as you were saying. And Tabby, would you like to add to that, please?
No, I think Dr. Rashi's viewpoint is spot on and advice. I think the first question, I have more questions for the lady than answers. The first would be, which part of the value chain do you want to operate in? Right. So before you even generate hydrogen itself, you need to have access to green energy, which is renewable energy. So do you want to operate in the manufacturing or the production of hydrogen itself, which goes through a different technology? The most prevalent one be electrolyzers. Do you want to work in the electrolyzer space? Do you want to work in the purification stage? Which part of the value chain do you want to exploit? And I think once you have established that, you can then go through a tick box, as Dr. Rashi has mentioned, once you've figured out which part of the value chain you need to play in. And I must say that green hydrogen, that as is currently being touted or presented, it's capital intensive. Sizable renewable energy projects are capital intensive. Electrolyzers are capital intensive. If you are using electrolyzers, electrolyzer technology, you need to be near a source, a good source of water. Do you have water? Because you're going to split water into oxygen and hydrogen, and that's how you get hydrogen. Where is that source of water? Do you want to play in that space? So you need to do a bit of homework. And now we're assuming that you haven't done homework. You probably have, and you have a clear idea. But those are the things that you need to think about. And also the country that, if it's Angola, it needs to have clear standards. Most countries, even European standards, are beginning to develop the standards for the sector. They are yet to be developed. So that's why I'm saying that we are in early stages. And I mean, I can really qualify that, but we don't have time. There are lots of things that need to be in place for the sector to take off. And of course, another important thing, who is going to be a buyer of your product? Is the offtake of your product, whichever part of the value chain that you're operating in, guaranteed? So happy to chat on LinkedIn about where you are, or you'll have our email addresses here. Happy to advise where we can. Thanks.
That's lovely. What a wonderful community feeling in this call today. Thank you so much. I found another question in the chat that I don't think we fully answered, although we maybe had some ideas in another question we were answering earlier. It was from Noura from France and Tunisia, and the question was addressed to you, Tabby, but let's feel free to open it up and see if you have other responses too, Eduarda and Rashi. How do you accelerate renewable energy penetration in a country where there is a vertically integrated actor, so a state-owned actor? What examples might some of you have for incentives, legal changes, mechanisms to tackle that? So a bit more of a specific question than the unwilling governments we had earlier. Tabby, do you want to answer, or is there anybody else who also wants to, Rashi or Eduarda, offer some thoughts?
I can give it a stab. I made an example earlier of an initiative that government established or implemented in the context of South Africa, where they introduced a public procurement program where government issues tenders in phases. In South African context, you call it bid windows, where you can partner with the private sector or independent power producers, and your vertically integrated utility becomes the buyer of that electricity. So it is possible to work within that vertically integrated model if government introduces a program of that nature. Of course, the market can also be liberalized where the regulation allow for a sale between a private generator and a private off-taker. And lastly, the government or regional or federal government or regional government can incentivize the installation of residential PV system or small-scale PV systems. They can perhaps introduce feed-in tariffs where, as a customer, if I am a prosumer or a producer of electricity that I consume myself, I can also sell access to the grid. So a feed-in tariffs type of scenario. So it ranges from where government leads and actually promotes procurement, where government sets a conducive environment for private sector cooperation and procurement between the different actors, to incentivizing the actual installations for various, whether it's tax incentives, tax breaks, and so on and so forth. South Africa has a couple of examples of that. But for us, I think I need to underpin my inputs by saying that the crisis forced us to a point where we relaxed our regulation to allow for more participation of the private sector. And so it is my hope that we really take this period that we are in as a crisis, and that it forces the entire global community to action. I don't think we still feel like it's crisis, when you have everything that you need, when you are not disturbed by the floods, when you don't lose your livelihood, you think, we will limit, whether we get to the goal or not, it doesn't really matter. But for most people, especially marginalized people, it matters. Yeah. But happy to get inputs from other panelists.
Thank you. Is there anything you want to add, Eduarda or Rashi?
I had a few thoughts on the hydrogen question, but this one I think has been responded. Just to
Feel free to
briefly
add to the hydrogen one. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Briefly, from my position, living in New York and being in the US, I think that the Inflation Reduction Act that was enacted recently in the US created a massive incentive for developing the green hydrogen, not just the green hydrogen, but the hydrogen supply chain globally, with the promise to reduce costs. But at the same time, it also displays some of the projects in developing countries, and investors are now moving to the US, which is a complicated thing, given that we're all here discussing tripling renewables and where the gap is, and the importance of diversifying our economies. I think that's very, complicated, especially when it comes to some of the trade agreements in the IRA that are specifically favoring countries that have trade relations with the US. So it's a complicated factor that, once again, I think we get into the geopolitics of it. But I think that when we're talking about hydrogen, it's such a new topic that I've heard a lot of people being very against, because they don't see this becoming a reality in the near-term future. While me, I'm more of a person, I'm more of an optimist, that I see, a lot of the renewable energy technologies follow a pattern of an S curve. And this is what RMI, I think, defends, which is we're going to get to that inflection point for the hydrogen as a technology, that the costs are going to decrease over time, and we're going to see actual penetration in the markets. But that does take a moment. And I think that the real question is, who are going to be the first movers? Who are the investors that are going to pay this first stage, which, for solar PV, Germany had the feed-in tariffs, and sometimes not just the money, but the subsidies and the policy incentives that are needed to move this market. But I know that we're done with the hydrogen conversation. Just wanted to pitch in as we're here.
Very able to circle back. That's no problem at all. And Rashi, over to you, please.
Yeah. For all the women listening here or even later, I think each one of you should look at what your country or your region, country is too large, just your region for the right energy mix, whether it's hydrogen, it's battery energy storage, or it's hydro, or it's just plain solar, just grid connected solar, or it's wind. What is the right energy mix for you? See, everyone will have their own hypes. Everyone will try to pull the attention of the investors. Every technology will try to do that. You need to analyze which is the right mix for you, your region, and your country, and your business for that matter. I did see in the chat that somebody is looking for mentorship and they want to start with some kind of energy initiative. So I would say find your right energy mix, because if you find your right energy mix, you know which direction to go to. Then you know where to get your finances from. Then you know where to get your inputs in terms of policy, in terms of procurement, in terms of what do you need to make this mix work. So I think looking at the energy mix would make more sense. And then these young women who want to come into the clean energy sector can focus more on having the right influence at their regional governments. Because again, coming back to the same pyramid, they are at the bottom of the pyramid. And what happens at the top of the pyramid rarely reaches the bottom of the pyramid. So it's easier if at the bottom of the pyramid, they're okay in managing themselves, creating an ecosystem which is sustainable over there, with integration of renewable energies, tripling, doubling, quadrupling, whatever we want to go with. But finding your right energy mix is the most important thing to begin with, at least if you want to step into the energy space.
Thank you very much. So we have another question that came in the chat. I just want to remind everybody that you may also switch on your cameras and mics if you want to ask your question directly, but you're very welcome to keep just popping them into the chat. I think we'll take one or two more. Lovely, thanks for the answer. So every mutual appreciation going on here. We'll take maybe one or two more questions and then I'll go for a little closing round in the panel. So another question that came in the chat was, what are the unexplored policy research gaps and the opportunities for advancing universal energy access in developing countries? So a bit more of an open question. Where would you like to see more research going into this field, particularly regarding policy areas? Please, Rashi.
Reducing the cost of energies. Some policy framework has to come because the privileged people are getting the energy at an X cost, and the underprivileged are not able to get it, even afford that cost. So that balance in access, of course, is the first challenge that we all have been talking about. After access comes affordability. So even if we can look into affordability at some aspect, I think that policy can make a big change, number one. Number two, more focusing on the decentralized, which is really neglected. I'm again harping on this point because, the bigger is easier to target. When you see a big chunk of energy, when you see a big chunk of a project coming in, everyone wants to have a bite and share. Okay, so there it's easy. But when you look at distributed, they are very, very small, tiny projects in maybe thousands or maybe millions, which need a robust policy reform, which need a guidance, a governance to actually reach the masses and actually create an impact that we all are looking ahead for. So I think these are two areas, at least to begin with. And once we begin with these, then we will have more challenges coming across our ways to have more policy improvements and creating a uniform access to everyone.
Thank you so much, Rashi. I'll let the other panelists answer. It's lovely to see you, Ellen. So we'll just complete the round of answers and then I'll hand over to you. Eduarda, you also raised your hand, please.
Oh, sorry. I thought, okay. No, I was just, I can be very brief, but I think that's true. That there are many areas that we still lack research, but one of them, considering this is Women Energize Women, and that most of us here are very interested in elevating the role of women in the energy sector, I think that we still, and we talk about this every year, and I see very little progress, which is having gender disaggregated data so that we can improve our analysis and really make a difference for including women everywhere and also serving them when it comes to energy access. That's, I think, number one and very important. But the second point for me that is maybe we don't lack research. I think we lack more the analysis and the implementation, which is looking at energy subsidies. And I was doing this research piece with the Inter-American Development Bank, which they were looking at how to be more now I forgot the term, but when you're doing targeted subsidies, because one issue that we have seen is that sometimes the subsidies, they favor the richer parts of the country that somehow manage to benefit from a subsidy, and we're not being able to properly serve the poorer ones. Or some countries, they established a ceiling. So if you're making, I don't know, $100 per month, you receive the subsidy. But if you make $105 a month, you don't receive the subsidy, yet you're still like an impoverished population. So I think that this research of trying to not leave people behind and looking at subsidies is very important. And also looking at fossil fuel subsidies, right? Because we in the, those of us that are environmentalists, that are defending the transition away from fossil fuels, I think we sometimes have to think of the reality that the subsidies from most governments will continue to exist. So how are we going to make better use of these government revenues from the fossil fuel industry? Are we creating funds with it to support renewable energy? Are we serving impoverished populations with energy access? I think these are some of ideas that I would love to see more research on and more collaboration, especially South-South cooperation of some of the best practices out there.
Absolutely. Thank you. Tabby, you also wanted to add some points to this.
Quick one. My first point supports Eduarda's one. I don't think there is shortage of policy, although we can certainly have or come up with various policy-related research. I think in the South African and African context is the actual implementation, you know, what kind of instruments, what kind of institutions are required to actually implement the policy that we put in place, and what format should that take? So I think that's one. Secondly, it's around business models. If we want to really use energy and renewable energy as a tool to revive economies of sub-Saharan Africa or generally developing countries, what kind of business models are required to deploy renewable energy technologies in general? You know, can there be participation of SMMEs? And if so, what kind of business models can they exploit? So those are two ideas that I'd like to submit. Thanks.
Thank you. Very important points added there. So the next person who raised their hand, allow me to give you a tiny introduction, is Ellen von Sitzewitz, who is in charge of climate and energy cooperation topics at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and of course also the, yes, let's say the leader of our Women Energize Women community. So over to you, Ellen.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, and thank you all. I'm calling today from a very cold and rainy Berlin, which also caught my cold and voice, so I'm not very clear. But I think it's a great, wonderful discussion here. I have a big question to you. I mean, we want to connect more dots. We will have the opportunity at COP28 to do so. The UAE presidency has also an ambition to do something about gender and climate, but it is very generic. So I would like to call you all, the panelists, but also the participants, if you have good ideas, to send us in. I mean, they have a very nice generic umbrella formulated that women play a very important role in climate, and a very important role also in adaptation and mitigation, but there are no real measures. They would like to monitor the process, that's clear, but I think they haven't defined any indicators, nothing. We need a few examples. If you can boil it down, I mean, we can't bring in everything what we like, but I think we have the opportunity. I was thinking that we need to refer to best practice examples. We can refer to existing initiatives. And in the end, I think it comes down to at least following three measures. We need to support, but we also need a clear target. And then in the end, it comes, sorry to say, sometimes also to measures like quota. But please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we need some hard words, some hard formulations after this conference where we can put that directly also into the UAE presidency paper. And then I would like to say that whoever comes to COP28, please let us know. We'll try to do an event in the blue zone and in the green zone. So the green zone, which is also open for non-accredited members. And we will try to make as much virtual preparation and input. For us, it's really important that you connect your dots. And I would like to thank especially also Rashi Gupta for your initiative in India, which I think was one of these examples where we could connect a little bit the dots. So please let us know also your ideas, your delegations, which are coming to COP, where we should address these topics. Maybe India is also planning something in its pavilion, or other countries too. Let us know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eduarda, do you want to go first and answer Ellen's question, please?
I would love to. And I think that that's such an important question, because again, I don't think that we lack standards when it comes to gender mainstreaming or these commitments. What we lack is the implementation. So I see a lot of them being made, but not really knowing how to implement it. So there are multiple sides to answer this and talk about best practices. I think one of them that for me is very important is the participation of women in climate negotiations. I think that the organization She Changes Climate shows the percentage of female participation at COPs, which has been more or less on the 34 to 35% over the last 5 years at COP. So it has not grown, it just plateaued. And these are women who are actually representing delegations of the decision makers, right? So I think that number one is how can we bring women to these spaces? So we were talking before about, women like us being in these spaces, but it's not just being there, it's also being able to meaningfully engage with these actors. So sharing some of the things we're saying here, because I know all of you here are supporters, but how can we convince the people that don't see the value in having women in these spaces? I think that's number one. I think number two is there are nowadays a lot of different funds, including the Gaga Fund, Mama Cash, that are dedicated funds to support climate-related projects that are led by women. I think that these funds are making a massive difference because what we're seeing in the the donor world and the international organization world is that there's more and more need to directly fund organizations on the ground, and not just international organizations, but smaller movements, grassroots movements that are really going, in the midst of rural areas in our countries and talking to people and making all the difference. So I think that supporting them. And when it comes to projects, actual projects, and how to mainstream gender, I think that the Climate Investment Fund released a report that I was also pitched in a little bit recently that talks a lot about how to think about gender mainstreaming in industry, in the private sector, and in civil society and the government. And this is to say that there are specific metrics that can be used, but they are not followed. And it has to come on the project preparation side. It shouldn't come afterwards. And I think that, as donors, many times you have to really enforce that to receive the funding, organizations have to think of that. What I've seen before, and now my last point, is just the importance of quotas. So sometimes when it comes to renewable energy projects, it's really being, okay, if we're going to do this, how many women are in the team? How many women are going to be supported by this project? Like, you have to force, it has to come from where the money is, otherwise the change is not going to come from the implementing organizations. It really has to be, and also not just a movement of one country or one organization, it has to be a global movement. I know that when it comes to governments, some governments are very pro-gender and they're already looking at their funding aligned to some of these gender metrics, but others are lagging behind and also need to be convinced. I wish, again, the dream is, at COP, that the discussion around gender is not only a female-led discussion. I wish there were more men to be part of these discussions, because ultimately they're making decisions and they completely forget that this is an important metric to take into consideration. So even doing the advocacy, doing the talking, and bringing these men in, I think is very important for for where we want to get in terms of gender equality in the energy sector.
Thank you very much. I'm sure your fellow panelists might want to share some thoughts on this as well. Tabby and Rashi, do you have things to add?
Sure, I like having young people on the panel because they have all the right ways of saying stuff. So Eduarda has really captured some of my sentiments really well. My wish is that we have a very clear 10-year target where women's events are not on the periphery, and that we not looking to women's event as side events. Yes, we should have events where we encourage each other. And that should be because the majority of women, capable women that have been groomed over the years, are able and ready to be part of the negotiation. So this generation should work towards us being the main people, part of the people. Some of the pictures that are taken of negotiators really are really sad to look at, where 98% of participation is by a male. So whether that is a metric or not, I'm not sure, but I think we need to really be ambitious about where we want to get to. We need not look for scraps, things that are falling off the table. We need to exert ourselves and have a very clear target and goal that we're working towards. That in 10 years' time, if this COP28 or whatever it is, we need to have a good representation of women that are negotiating and not just on a side event because they can't get around the table. Yeah, that's my wish.
Thank you very much for voicing that. Rashi, how about you? Some points to add from your side, some wishes to add from your side, perhaps?
You've asked me the most difficult question today. my wishes would be to see more empowered women on board. Very difficult task. I would want to see more networking. Women are very shy by default. They don't open up much. So I would want to see that change. And I would want to see a change in upbringing of men. This is the broad changes that I want to see. Not upbringing of women, upbringing of men, upbringing of our children, how we raise our boys. Big changes. My wish list is, very ambitious, many times very ambitious. But at COP, what again I would repeat is I would see more collaborations than negotiations. I'm again repeating this. It's a very, very big wish list, a very ambitious wish list. And as both my co-panelists have here said that we want more women. But I have seen women at the negotiation table being suppressed. Their voices are being not heard. Their voices are suppressed completely. I have seen this at even G20. I have seen this at last COP. And something that I want to also see is more sustainability at COP. We're talking of sustainability and we're talking of conference of parties and we're negotiating for making a big climate impact. But we're forgetting that we have to practice what we preach. And that has not happened at COP. It's a very bold statement that I'm making publicly at large on a global platform today. But we have to learn to do that. If we are the climate warriors, we need to first look into saving and doing our bit instead of just preaching. And we have not been doing that. I'm sorry, all of us are equally contributing still to this climate emergency, including me. And we need a change ourselves. So at COP, I would want to see first that the temperatures inside the COP zone are maintained to just 5 degrees that they're outside and not chilled as a refrigerator. Simple things, simple steps, less use of plastics at COP. I mean, I know I still had a water bottle which was plastic. I had no choice here where I'm sitting. And you know what? And this has to come from the country levels. I mean, today at the conference that I am in here, I see very few women participants. Though the session for women in energy was full, but still, at overall participation, if I look at, women participation is less. When are we going from the administrative only approach to a full-blown approach that we can do all the aspects of energy and not just administration? We can do all the aspects of STEM and not just do administration or clerical work that we have been doing for so long. This is very important. That mindset change and shift is important. And when I see, when I was recently in New York for the UNGA, during those times, I just saw that again, women representation was very less. When are we going to come out, hop onto the plane, get in there, or hop onto the train and get in there and say that we need this done? When? 2030, 2050, or now? When? The choice is yours, my friend. The choice is absolutely yours. Make a choice today. If you don't choose today, you do not have a tomorrow. Please choose today.
Thank you all so much. I think, think big and wish big, I think, is the sentiment that we're closing with today. And very much this idea that we can support each other to elevate our voices and need to call for that support. Like, let's not be afraid to ask each other for help. on a very practical note, there have been some questions still in the chat that we didn't fully answer, but many of those are asking for resources, for tips, for links. So thanks to all of you who are already sharing those. If you have anything else to share, perhaps we can keep the chat open for another couple of minutes. And now, as a final item on our agenda, I'd like to invite you all to take a group picture with me. That means those of you who want to can switch on the cameras so we can wave together in the exact sentiment that we closed in, of like you all working so hard, being part of this change and driving it. So I'd really at this point would like to very much thank the fantastic panel. This was my absolute honor to be in this virtual room with you today and to listen to your experiences, your thoughts. So thank you, Dr. Rashi. Thank you, Dr. Tavi and Eduarda. Thank you so much. It was really enriching to hear your thoughts and to spend this little bit of time together. And thanks also for your offers of support to our participants and perhaps being in touch to follow up with and see how we can connect even better.